If you grew up in Hamilton, you grew up knowing what Stelco meant. The blast furnaces on the waterfront, the orange glow over Burlington Bay at night, the fathers and uncles who walked through those same gates every shift for 3 generations. At its peak, 26,000 workers across 1,100 acres made the steel that built post-war Canada. They survived 2 world wars, survived the Great Depression without missing a single dividend, survived a 125-day strike, a 97-day strike, and 26 months in bankruptcy court. And then, after more than a century of making steel in Hamilton, the blast furnaces went cold for the last time. How does a company that survived all of that simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1: The Horseback Man and the Harbor. The story begins at the western tip of Lake Ontario, in a city that smelled of iron before it had a name for the smell. Hamilton sat where geography demanded a steel town: Burlington Bay for lake shipping, the Welland Canal route to the upper lakes for iron ore, rail connections running south to Pennsylvania anthracite and Appalachian coking coal, and the emerging factories of Toronto, less than 50 miles to the northeast, hungry for metal. By the late 19th century, Hamilton had become Canada's premier iron city. What it hadn't yet become was a place that made its own steel. That changed because of a man who arrived on horseback. Charles Secord Wilcox rode into Hamilton in 1880. He was not yet 30, not yet wealthy, and not yet anyone of consequence in the Canadian iron trade. He'd come to join the Ontario Rolling Mills in the city's West End, a modest operation that had been turning out wrought iron since 1861, one of the earliest metalworking plants in the Dominion of Canada. The work was hard, the pay was middling, and the business was entirely dependent on pig iron shipped in from somewhere else. Hamilton rolled metal. It didn't smelt it. Every ingot that entered those mills had already been made by someone in another city, another country, and the men who ran Ontario Rolling Mills understood exactly what that dependency cost them. Wilcox understood it too, and over the next 15 years, he would help change it. The critical moment came in 1895, when the Hamilton Blast Furnace Company was established at Huckleberry Point on Burlington Bay, the first facility in the city capable of producing pig iron from raw ore. Overnight, the local metal trades could drop their import costs. Hamilton no longer needed to beg Pittsburgh or Birmingham for its feedstock. The furnace married the city's existing rolling capacity to its own smelting capability, and in 1899, the 2 operations merged: Hamilton Blast Furnace and Ontario Rolling Mills, becoming the Hamilton Steel and Iron Company. Library and Archives Canada would later describe it as Canada's first fully integrated iron and steel company. Its first president was Charles S. Wilcox, the man who'd ridden into town on a horse 19 years earlier. But Wilcox had ambitions beyond Hamilton, and in 1910, those ambitions collided with a financier whose name would become famous on 2 continents for reasons that had nothing to do with steel. Chapter 2: The Broker, the Merger, and the Tariff Wall. Max Aitken was 30 years old in 1910, a self-made maritime financier from Newcastle, New Brunswick, already notorious in Canadian business circles for assembling corporate mergers with the speed and audacity of a card-sharp dealing from the bottom of the deck. He'd brokered the creation of Canada Cement the year before. He'd orchestrated the merger that became the steel company of Canada's chief rival, Algoma Steel, in Sault Ste. Marie. He would later cross the Atlantic, buy the Daily Express, become Lord Beaverbrook, serve as Winston Churchill's Minister of Aircraft Production during the Blitz, and die one of the most powerful press barons in British history. But in the spring of 1910, he was still Max Aitken, and he was putting together the biggest industrial consolidation Hamilton had ever seen. The catalyst was William McMaster, who ran the Montreal Rolling Mills on Notre Dame Street in Saint-Henri. McMaster's problem was simple. His mill needed a guaranteed supply of primary steel, and buying it on the open market left him exposed to price swings and supply disruptions. He approached Aitken with a proposal: bring Montreal Rolling Mills into a larger organization that could secure its own feedstock. Aitken, who had never met a merger he didn't like, promptly expanded the concept beyond anything McMaster had imagined. On June 8, 1910, the Steel Company of Canada was incorporated through the consolidation of 5 firms. The Canada Screw Company, Limited, established in 1866. Montreal Rolling Mills Co.S., established in 1868. The Canada Bolt and Nut Company. The Dominion Wire Manufacturing Company, established in 1883. And the Hamilton Steel and Iron Company, Wilcox's creation, the anchor of the whole arrangement, contributing the blast furnaces and rolling mills that gave the new entity its integrated steelmaking capacity. The Royal Bank, the Canadian Pacific Railway, and the Bank of Hamilton were represented on the founding board. It was capitalized with Hamilton and Montreal money. Not British, not American. This was Canadian industrial ambition, assembled by a New Brunswicker in a Hamilton boardroom. Wilcox became the first president, and from the beginning, he established the principle that would define Stelco's first half-century. Plow back as much profit as possible into the company. No lavish dividends, no executive palaces. Reinvest, build, expand. It was the opposite of the extraction model that would eventually destroy the company, and Wilcox pursued it relentlessly from 1910 until his death in 1938. But the merger alone didn't make Stelco viable. What made Stelco viable, what made every Canadian steelmaker viable, was a wall. A tariff wall. John A. Macdonald's national policy, implemented in the budget of March 14, 1879, had imposed protective tariffs of 15 to 25% on imported manufactured goods, rising as high as 32% by 1891. Iron and steel were named as priority sectors. The logic was blunt. Without protection, Canadian mills, smaller, newer, with shorter production runs and higher per-unit costs than the integrated giants of Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana, could not survive against American steel dumped north of the border at prices Hamilton couldn't match. Recent econometric research has confirmed what Macdonald's conservatives understood intuitively. Industries that received greater protection experienced faster growth in output and productivity, as well as larger price reductions. Higher tariffs promoted rapid industrialization. The tariff wall was not a subsidy, it was the foundation. Robert Borden's conservatives cemented that protection in the 1911 federal election, fought and won against Wilfrid Laurier's reciprocity agreement with the United States. The tariff wall held, and behind it, Stelco grew. Wilcox served as president until 1916, then moved to board chairman, a position he held until his death 22 years later. Robert Hobson succeeded him as president from 1916 to 1926, maintaining the reinvestment ethic through the upheaval of the First World War. Ross H. McMaster, son of the very William McMaster, whose Montreal rolling mills had started the whole consolidation, took the presidency in 1926 and would hold it through the Depression and into the Second War. 3 presidents in 35 years, each one a steelman, each one building. That stability would prove essential, because within 4 years of the company's founding, the world went to war, and Stelco went with it. Chapter 3. Shells, Steel, and the Wars That Made the Company. The telegram came in August 1914, and Stelco converted a large part of its operations to produce materiel before the first Canadian divisions had crossed the Atlantic. The demand was staggering. The Imperial Munitions Board, coordinating war production across the Dominion, placed orders that would have seemed fantastical in peacetime. Stelco's Brantford and Montreal plants, the Notre Dame Street works in Saint-Henri, that William McMaster had brought into the merger just 4 years earlier, produced approximately 119,000 shells in 1915. By 1917, that number had quadrupled to 537,555. By 1918, the final year, the desperate year, the year the Western Front consumed metal faster than the entire industrial world could produce it, Stelco's combined plants turned out 1,312,616 shells, 9.2-inch shells, 4.5-inch howitzer Mark V, 60-pounder Mark V, 18-pounder Mark VII shrapnel. The output of steel ingots doubled from pre-war levels. More than 3,000 new employees were hired. More than 100 Stelco workers enlisted. The company held their jobs. The war didn't just expand Stelco. It transformed the company's technology. In 1917, Stelco built its first sheet mill, a facility capable of producing flat-rolled steel for a market far broader than the bolts, screws, and wire that had been the founding company's bread and butter. In 1918, the company erected a modern byproduct coke oven, the first one designed to capture coal tar and gas rather than vent them into Hamilton's already acrid air. These weren't wartime improvisations. They were permanent expansions, paid for by shell contracts, that repositioned Stelco as a diversified steelmaker capable of serving the automotive, appliance, and construction industries that would define Canada's 20th century. And then, the world stopped buying shells, and the question became whether Stelco could survive the peace. It could. Stelco's diversified base, the screws, bolts, wire, and nails inherited from the 5 founding companies, proved a Depression-era hedge that pure steelmakers didn't have. When construction collapsed and automotive demand cratered in the early 1930s, Stelco's secondary products kept the revenue coming. Increased duties on American steel imports after 1930 reinforced the tariff wall just when it was needed most. Between 1918 and 1932, in the teeth of the worst economic crisis the industrial world had ever seen, Stelco's share of the Canadian steel market rose from 17% to 45%. The company never missed a dividend through the entire Depression. Not one. In 1935, the 25th anniversary year, Stelco established the Quarter Century Club, honoring employees who'd given 25 years of service. It was a small gesture, a dinner, a pin, a handshake from Ross McMaster, but it carried a message that mattered in a decade when factories across North America were closing without ceremony or sentiment. Stelco valued loyalty. Stelco remembered its people. That message would echo for decades, and its betrayal, when it came, would cut all the deeper for it. Then the world went to war again, and this time Canada would become something no one, least of all the Canadians themselves, had imagined possible. C.D. Howe changed everything. The Minister of Everything, running the Department of Munitions and Supply from April 9, 1940, turned Canada into the world's 4th largest war producer in under 3 years. The numbers are difficult to absorb even now. Canadian industry manufactured 16,400 aircraft, 815,729 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 600 naval vessels. The country supplied 40% of Allied aluminum, 95% of Allied nickel, and 100% of Allied uranium. A nation of 11 million people, most of them farmers and fishermen and small-town shopkeepers a decade earlier, built an industrial arsenal that outproduced empires. Stelco threw its efforts into supplying steel for the building of ships and army transports, alongside continued shell production. The company erected plate and hot strip mills in 1941, adding yet more capacity that would outlast the war and serve the post-war construction boom. By 1943, 1,500 of Stelco's approximately 7,000 employees, more than 1 in 5, were in uniform, and the company hired women for the first time to fill the gaps on the shop floor. The Hamilton Works hummed around the clock. 3 shifts, 7 days. The blast furnaces running so hot that the orange glow of the flared gas was visible from Burlington, across the bay, to anyone who looked south after dark. By 1948, steel mills across Canada were exceeding their wartime capacity. The infrastructure of a peacetime industrial nation was being laid in Hamilton, in the same buildings, by many of the same hands that had built the arsenal. Stelco was no longer a regional steelmaker with a diversified product line. It was one of the industrial pillars of the country. And its workers, the men who'd run the furnaces through 2 wars, who'd never missed a dividend through the Depression, who'd seen the company grow from 5 merged firms into a national enterprise, those workers had something to say about what they were owed. Chapter 4. The Founding Strike. They gathered at the Playhouse Theater on Sherman Avenue on a sweltering July Sunday in 1946, a mass meeting of Stelco workers. most of them still in their 20s and 30s, many of them recently home from the war, all of them angry. The company that had profited enormously from their labor during the conflict was offering peacetime wages that bore no resemblance to what American steelworkers earned across the border. There was no formal union recognition, no grievance procedure, no seniority system, no dues checkoff. The men who'd built shells for Normandy were being told to be grateful for what they had. They voted to strike, and on July 15, 1946, they walked off the job. The demands were specific: a 40-hour work week, paid vacation, union dues checkoff, formal recognition of the United Steelworkers of America Local 1005, and wage parity with U.S. Steel's American operations. The workers weren't asking for revolution. They were asking for what American steelworkers already had, and they were prepared to stand in front of those gates on Burlington Street until they got it. Stelco's response was immediate and hostile. The company hired roughly 2,000 strikebreakers. Approximately 500 Ontario Provincial Police and Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers were deployed to Hamilton, a show of force that made it clear where Ottawa's sympathies lay. The stage was set for the kind of confrontation that either breaks a union or makes one. What happened next made the union. Sam Lawrence, born in 1879 in Somerset, England, a former stonemason who'd emigrated to Canada and risen through Hamilton's labor politics to become the first CCF member of the legislature elected in Ontario in 1934, was the mayor of Hamilton. He'd held the office since 1944, and he would hold it until 1949. And on the day the police massed at the Stelco gates, Lawrence did something that no one in Ottawa or Queen's Park expected. He led a march. 10,000 people walked from Woodlands Park to the gates of the Stelco plant. Lawrence was at the front, the mayor of the city, marching alongside the strikers against the company that was Hamilton's largest employer and its most powerful economic institution. He refused to call in police to clear the pickets. He refused to call the military. And he declared, on the record, that the government was acting as the nation's chief strikebreaker. The city took his side. Hamilton restaurant workers refused to serve police officers in uniform. Kitchen staff at the police lodging house refused to cook for them. The solidarity was not organized from above. It rose from the streets of a working-class city that understood, viscerally, that if Stelco could break this union, every shop floor in Hamilton was next. The picket lines held for 81 days. Bill Scanlon, a nailmaker at the plant, served as the strike's entertainment coordinator, organizing baseball games at the picket camps and arranging visits from Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, who played for the Hamilton Steelworkers on a makeshift stage within earshot of the silent furnaces. Scanlon would later run for federal parliament with the CCF in 1957 and again in 1958, carrying the moral authority of a man who'd kept 3,000 strikers fed and entertained through a Hamilton summer without a paycheck. The strike settled on October 4, 1946, with a vote of 2,173 to 112. Stelco President Hugh Hilton and USWA National Director Charles H. Millard signed the agreement. Formal union recognition, a seniority system, a grievance procedure, wage increases. Local 1005 was born. And with it, a pattern that would define Stelco for the next 60 years. A pattern of militancy, confrontation, hard-won gains, and bitter costs that no one standing on those picket lines in the summer of 1946 could have foreseen. The city remembered. In December 1946, Hamilton went to the polls, and Sam Lawrence won re-election with a record 65.1% voter turnout. The strikers' mayor, vindicated. The city that had stood with its workers, confirmed. But Hamilton's establishment remembered too, and their memory was less generous. In April 1947, just 6 months after the strike's triumphant end, the city council demolished Woodlands Park. The park where the strikers had gathered. The park where Lawrence had rallied 10,000 marchers. The park where Guthrie and Seeger had played, and Scanlon had organized baseball, and the workers had held the line through the longest summer of their lives. The council tore it down. No replacement was built. The message was clear enough. You may have won the strike, but we'll erase the ground you stood on. It was a petty act. It was also a prophecy. Stelco would spend the next half-century locked in a cycle of strikes and settlements, each one extracting something from the other side, each one leaving scars that never fully healed. The 1946 strike was the founding act of Local 1005, one of the most militant locals in the Canadian labor movement. It was also the first chapter in a relationship between company and union that would produce 81 days in 1946, 86 in 1958, a violent wildcat in 1966, a legal strike in 1969, 125 days in 1981, and 97 days in 1990, a bitter cadence, roughly one major walkout per decade, that built the working-class middle class of Hamilton and simultaneously bled the company of the competitive flexibility it needed to survive what was coming from across the border. Dofasco profits, Stelco fights. That was the Hamilton saying, and it would become the epitaph. But in 1946, the fighting had just begun, and across the harbor, visible from the Stelco gates if you looked east through the haze of coke oven smoke, a different company was already writing the alternative script. Dofasco, founded just 2 years after Stelco in 1912, had introduced profit sharing in 1938 and avoided unionization entirely through what its workers called the Dofasco way. No strikes, no lockouts, ever. The contrast was already sharp. It would become the moral spine of everything that followed. For now, though, Stelco's workers had their union, their contracts, and their pride. And the company had something too. A new president named Hugh Hilton, an engineer, the last steelman who would ever run the place, who was about to spend $250 million making Stelco the largest steelmaker in the country. The golden age was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Engineer's Kingdom. Hugh G. Hilton was the last of a particular kind. A steelmaking engineer who understood what happened inside a blast furnace, not because he'd read about it, but because he'd stood close enough to feel it through his boots. He became president in 1945, the same year the war ended, and he inherited a company that had just spent 5 years running flat out for the Allied war effort. The plant was tired. The equipment was worn. The men were coming home. And Hilton looked at all of it and saw not exhaustion, but opportunity. Over the next 12 years, he spent $250 million on expansion and modernization, more than twice the total spent between 1910 and 1949 combined. It was the largest capital program in Stelco's history, and it transformed the Hamilton Works from a capable wartime producer into the largest steel-making complex in Canada. The numbers arrived like hammer blows. In 1951, Hilton built a 226-foot blast furnace, the tallest in the country, alongside new open-hearth furnaces that increased Canadian ingot capacity by 20% in a single year. That new furnace alone produced 1,400 tons of iron a day, enough to fill a freight train stretching from the plant gates to the Burlington Skyway. Continuous strip mills followed, then electrolytic tinning lines, a new blooming mill, a sintering plant that processed iron ore fines into usable feedstock. In 1959, a metallurgical and chemical laboratory was built at the Hamilton Works, where Stelco's own engineers pioneered oxygen-enriched open-hearth combustion, a process innovation that squeezed more steel from less fuel and gave Hamilton a technical edge over mills that were still running on pre-war methods. The works was renamed Hilton Works in his honor, and it sprawled. At its peak in the 1970s and early 1980s, Hilton Works covered approximately 1,100 acres on Hamilton's waterfront, a landmass larger than downtown Toronto's financial district, stretched along Burlington Bay like a city within a city. Canadian Business would later describe it as an ever-evolving assortment of blast furnaces, mills, coke ovens, rolling mills, and coating lines. 4 blast furnaces stood at the heart of the complex, the famous D&E furnaces, the tallest and most productive. Annual capacity at Hilton Works alone reached approximately 2.8 million tons. Total Stelco capacity across all facilities peaked at about 6.2 million tons. Imagine walking through those gates on a January morning in 1972. You'd leave your car in a parking lot that held 3,000 vehicles, a sea of Chevrolets and Fords and Pontiacs, frost still on the windshields, exhaust plumes rising in the -15 air. The plant stretched ahead of you in every direction, a landscape of corrugated steel walls, overhead cranes, rail spurs, and pipe runs that seemed to have no end. The sound hit first, a low, continuous roar that wasn't any single machine, but the aggregate vibration of an entire steelmaking operation running at capacity, a frequency you felt through the soles of your boots before your ears fully registered it. Above you, the stacks vented steam and coke oven gas into air so cold it turned the emissions into vertical columns that rose hundreds of feet before the wind caught them and bent them east across the bay. Inside the blast furnace building, the scale shifted from industrial to geological. The furnace was a vertical shaft over 200 feet tall, fed continuously with layers of iron ore, coke, and limestone, heated from below by blasts of superheated air that kept the interior above 1,500 degrees Celsius. When a furnace was tapped, when the plug at the base was opened and molten iron poured into the waiting ladle, the light was blinding, an orange-white radiance that threw shadows 50 meters long and made the men nearest the pour turn their faces away instinctively, even through their heat shields. The temperature contrast with the outside was so extreme that workers developed their own layering system, coveralls that could be stripped in seconds, felt-lined boots for the walk-in, and steel-toed safety boots for the floor. Nobody taught you this. You learned it from the man beside you, or you suffered through your first winter until you figured it out yourself. The coke oven sat adjacent, long batteries of narrow chambers where coal was baked at over 1,000 degrees for 18 hours, driving off volatile gases and leaving behind the hard, porous carbon that fueled the blast furnaces. The heat radiating from the oven doors was visible in the air itself, a shimmering distortion that made everything behind it waver like a mirage. The smell was distinctive and inescapable, a sulfurous, tarry, sweet acrid composite that hung over East Hamilton like a signature, so familiar that residents could tell from the scent alone which way the wind was blowing. The National Film Board documentary, Coke Ovens, A High-Risk Job, filmed at Stelco, captured a worker saying flatly, "Hamilton has the highest rate of lung cancer in Canada, and possibly in the world." The men who worked those ovens knew the risk. They worked them anyway, because the ovens paid well, and the pension at the end, if you lived to collect it, was the best in the plant. From the blast furnace, molten iron moved to the open hearth furnaces, and later the basic oxygen furnace, where it was refined into steel. From there to the blooming mill, where white-hot ingots were rolled into slabs and billets, the floor shaking with each pass through the rolls. From there to the strip mill, where slabs were rolled progressively thinner into sheet steel, the product that ended up as car doors in Oshawa, appliance panels in Hamilton, tin cans on grocery shelves in Vancouver. The journey from raw ore to finished product took days, passed through the hands of hundreds of workers, and generated enough waste heat to warm a small city, which, in effect, it did. The thermal output of Hilton Works measurably raising the ambient temperature of the surrounding neighborhoods in winter. At night, the plant was something else entirely. Flared blast furnace gas burned through the darkness, an orange glow visible from the Niagara Escarpment, from Burlington across the bay, and to every motorist on the Queen Elizabeth Way. Canadian Business would write that the plant spewed emulsified oils into Hamilton Harbor and belched noxious fumes into the sky. Flared gas from its furnaces burned through the night. It was beautiful in the way a volcano is beautiful, dangerous, mesmerizing, and impossible to look away from. For a generation of Hamilton children, that glow was the last thing they saw from their bedroom windows before falling asleep. It meant the furnaces were running. It meant their fathers were working. It meant the city was alive. Chapter 6. Burlington Street at Shift Change. Steve Lekniak joined Stelco in the late 1960s, straight out of high school, and he stayed for 36 years. When CBC Hamilton asked him about it decades later, in the autumn of his retirement, his voice carried the particular weight of a man describing something that no longer exists. "When I finished high school," Lekniak said, "the jobs in Hamilton were literally a dime a dozen. You could go anywhere. It's a cliché, but it's true. You could walk up and down Burlington Street, door to door, knock on the door, I need a job, you would get a job right away. There's just no question about it. Burlington Street was the spine of it. David Waring, who taught liberal studies at Mohawk College, remembered it the same way. Burlington Street was the industrial engine that moved the machinery of civic, commercial, and political life. Most of the dads in the neighborhood where I grew up, Red Hill Ravine, between Queenston Road and King Street, east of Parkdale Avenue, worked on Burlington Street. Not worked at Stelco specifically, worked on Burlington Street because the street itself was the employer. A corridor of heavy industry that included Stelco, Dofasco, International Harvester, Firestone, Westinghouse, and a constellation of smaller fabricators and suppliers that fed the giants. At shift change, the street became a river of hard hats and lunch pails, men walking 4 and 5 abreast on the sidewalks. The Tim Hortons on Kenilworth jammed from 5:30 in the morning, the parking lots emptying and filling in synchronized waves 3 times a day. The workforce that filled those shifts came from everywhere. The Workers' City Project documented the pattern with precision. Anglo-Saxon men still did most of the highly skilled work. The less skilled workers were mostly immigrants who came in a large wave in the early 1900s. Each plant seemed to attract specific ethnic groups. Italians predominated in the blast furnace at Stelco. International Harvester imported a large number of Poles from its Chicago plant. Large numbers of Armenians got on the company payroll a few years later. After the war, new waves arrived: Portuguese, Greek, Polish, Croatian, Serbian, Hungarian, settling along Barton Street East and James Street North, in neighborhoods where the language on the shop floor followed you home to the dinner table and the church hall and the Saturday night social club. The Italian community centered on James Street North, the Portuguese on Dundurn. The Polish had their own hall, their own parish, their own patterns of hiring that brought cousins and brothers-in-law into the same departments where the men who'd sponsored their immigration already worked. The factory was the integration engine. English, or something close to it, was learned on the shop floor, shouted over the noise of the rolling mill, picked up in the break room over coffee and cigarettes. Stelco didn't run language classes. It didn't need to. The work itself was the classroom, and the shared vocabulary was the vocabulary of steel. Tapping, pouring, rolling, shearing, the names of tools and processes that sounded the same in any accent. The Brightside neighborhood, directly adjacent to Hilton Works Manchester and Wilcox Gates, told the story of proximity in its own way. Families lived so close to the plant that they could hear the furnaces from their kitchen tables. When Stelco expanded in the late 1950s and 1960s, Brightside was demolished. Houses, streets, an entire community bulldozed to make room for more steelmaking capacity. An oral history exhibit at Hamilton Civic Museums documented the names of former residents: John Fioravanti, Mary Fioravanti, Nello Giavidoni, people whose homes were purchased, torn down, and paved over so that Stelco could pour more steel. The neighborhood vanished. The families scattered across Hamilton's East End. The only record that Brightside ever existed is in the memories of people who are now very old and in a museum exhibit curated by Tara Bursey. But for the workers who kept their homes and kept their jobs, the wages built a life. A Stelco paycheck in the 1960s and 1970s bought a brick bungalow on the East Mountain, a Ford or Chevy in the driveway, hockey equipment for the boys, a week at a rented cottage on Lake Erie in the summer. It bought membership at the Legion, Friday night beers at the neighborhood tavern, a seat in the Union Hall on Barton Street, where Local 1005 held its meetings. It bought a pension, the promise that after 30 years of breathing coke oven gas and standing in the heat of the blast furnace, you'd have enough to live on without working until you died. Lechniak, looking back. Steelworkers supported this city. They really did. These people got by. They raised their families. They paid their mortgages. They bought cars, and they didn't have a degree. You could hardly find a single person in Hamilton that wasn't in some way connected directly to the making of steel. The union was the other anchor. USW Local 1005 was, by reputation and by record, one of the most militant locals in Canada, a distinction that carried pride and cost in roughly equal measure. The bitter pattern of one major strike per decade defined Stelco's labor relations and contributed to the company's long-term competitive erosion. But it also produced wages, benefits, and pensions that were among the best in Canadian manufacturing. The men who walked picket lines in 1958 and 1966 and 1969 weren't fighting for abstract principles. They were fighting for the mortgage, the car, the hockey equipment, the cottage, the material texture of a working-class life that required real money and real job security to sustain. The union delivered. The company paid. And year by year, the cost of that delivery crept upward against a global steel market that was getting cheaper, faster, and less patient with Hamilton's particular way of doing business. Across the harbor, Dofasco told the alternative story. Founded in 1912 as Dominion Steel Castings Company by Clifton and Frank A. Sherman, Dofasco had introduced profit sharing in 1938. 14% of pre-tax profits split equally across the entire workforce, with eligibility after 2 to 3 years of service, plus variable compensation of roughly 10% of salary on top. The Dofasco way kept the workforce non-union, kept the strikes at zero, and kept the relationship between labor and management in a register that Stelco's workers would have found unrecognizable. There were no picket lines at Dofasco. There were profit-sharing checks. The distinction was Hamilton's defining industrial contrast, and everyone in the city understood it. The steelworkers at both plants, the shopkeepers on James Street, the politicians at City Hall, the kids at school who knew which plant their father worked at, and what that said about their family's relationship with money, risk, and the future. Chapter 7. The Invisible Steel. Here is the paradox that made Stelco unusual among Canada's great industrial enterprises. Almost no Canadian could name a single Stelco product, and yet almost every Canadian used Stelco steel every day of their lives. The automotive sheet that became car doors and hoods and fenders at GM's plant in Oshawa, at Ford in Oakville, at Chrysler in Windsor, and the parts plants scattered across St. Catharines and the Niagara Peninsula. That was Stelco steel. The construction rebar buried in the foundations of apartment towers and office buildings across post-war Toronto, Calgary, and Montreal. Stelco. The structural shapes that held up highway overpasses and hospital wings and the expanding corridors of Pearson International Airport. Stelco. The appliance steel inside every Inglis washing machine, every Westinghouse refrigerator, every Camco stove that sat in every suburban kitchen in every new subdivision from Scarborough to Surrey. Stelco. Rail steel for CN and CP. Pipe and tube for the post-war pipeline expansion that carried Alberta oil east and natural gas west. Tin plate for the cans on every grocery shelf in the country. The company's own laboratories developed products that architects and engineers specified by name. Stelcolor, a permanently bonded color steel for architectural cladding, introduced in the 1960s, gave Canadian architects a building material that combined the strength of structural steel with the aesthetic flexibility of painted finishes. Stelcolloy, a weathering steel that oxidized decoratively into a rich, rust-brown patina rather than corroding destructively, became a prestige material for brutalist buildings and public art installations across the country. Canadian architects designed feature facades around these products, and Stelco actively promoted them in architectural journals, bridging the gap between heavy industry and design culture in a way that few steelmakers anywhere in the world attempted. By 1960, Stelco maintained sales offices in Halifax, St. John, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Hamilton, London, Windsor, Sudbury, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver, 13 cities spanning the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a truly national company, and the numbers reflected it. In 1963, Stelco produced more than 3 million tons of steel ingots in a single year, a Canadian record. By 1968, production had surpassed 4 million tons. Stelco's first billion-dollar revenue year came in the early 1970s, with approximately 24,000 employees on the payroll. The company was not just Hamilton's largest employer. It was one of the defining industrial institutions of the country, mentioned in the same breath as CN Rail, Alcan, Inco, and the big banks as pillars of the Canadian economy. And yet the steel itself remained invisible. You couldn't walk into a store and buy a Stelco product. You couldn't point to a building and say, "That's Stelco," unless you'd read the structural drawings. The orange glow over Hamilton Harbor was famous. The name on the tower at 100 King Street West was famous. The plant itself, sprawling along the waterfront like a small industrial nation, was famous. But the steel that made all of it worthwhile disappeared into the fabric of Canadian life the moment it left the mill gates, anonymous and essential, like water pressure or electrical current, something you never thought about until it wasn't there. That invisibility would matter later. When the furnaces went cold, when the jobs disappeared, when 20,000 pensioners lost their health benefits, the public sympathy was real, but the public urgency was muted. Stelco wasn't a brand that Canadians had an emotional relationship with. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it fails, produces inconvenience and concern, not the visceral grief that accompanies the loss of something people loved. Chapter 8. 26,000. In 1981, Stelco employed 26,000 workers. 26,000. That single number, confirmed across every source that has ever examined the company, represents the summit, the highest point, the year the company reached the peak of its employment, its capacity, its national reach, and its confidence. Net sales would exceed $3 billion for the first time. Canadian steel consumption was at record highs, and at Nanticoke, on the north shore of Lake Erie, Stelco had just opened the crown jewel of its modernization program. Lake Erie Works was everything Hamilton was not. Commissioned in 1980, it was a greenfield mill, built from scratch on clean land, with no legacy infrastructure to work around, no century-old buildings to accommodate, no compromises inherited from the decisions of previous generations. It was designed with continuous casting, reduced water use, modern environmental controls, and a layout optimized for efficiency rather than constrained by the geography of Burlington Bay. U.S. Steel itself, which would buy the plant 27 years later, described Lake Erie Works as the most modern integrated steel plant in North America. The capacity was planned for far more than it would ever produce, designed to ramp beyond 2.5 million tons annually, with finishing lines that would process the slabs on site rather than shipping them to Hamilton for rolling and coating. Those finishing lines were never built. That is the detail that carries the weight of everything that followed. The 1981 strike stopped the construction. Cecil "Sec" Taylor, president of USW Local 1005, described by Maclean's as an avowed nationalist and a member of the radical arm of the New Democratic Party, led 12,500 Hilton workers off the job at midnight on August 1, 1981. The dispute was wages. The union demanded $2 per hour in the first year, plus $1 in the second. Stelco's chairman J. Peter Gordon and chief negotiator Victor Harris offered 75 cents in the first year and 20 cents in each of the following two. The shift premiums were insulting, 5 cents an hour for night work, an amount so small that workers took it as a deliberate provocation. Taylor's response was blunt and absolute. The strike lasted 125 days, the longest in Stelco's history. Most Stelco plants settled by August 24th, but Hilton Works held out until December 3rd, when a 77% ratification vote ended it with base rates rising to $15 an hour by August 1984, plus cost of living adjustments potentially adding another $1.60. Taylor's comment on the ratification captured something essential about the man and the local he led. "I'm a bit disappointed the vote was so high. I would have liked to have seen less support because it may make Stelco think they gave us more than we deserved." The strike was won. The wages were won. But the timing was catastrophic. The 1981-82 recession, the deepest since the Depression, triggered by Paul Volcker's interest rate shock at the Federal Reserve, hit Canadian manufacturing like a wrecking ball. Steel demand collapsed, orders dried up, and the capital that would have built Lake Erie's finishing lines evaporated. Stelco's management looked at the numbers: a new plant half-finished, a recession deepening, a workforce that had just held them to ransom for 4 months, and made a calculation that seemed reasonable at the time and proved fatal in the long run. They stopped building. Lake Erie Works would operate for the next 4 decades at a fraction of its intended capacity, producing slabs that had to be shipped to Hamilton for finishing. An extra step, an extra cost, and inefficiency baked into the company's cost structure for the rest of its existence. The Globe and Mail, looking back in 2016, would summarize it with devastating economy. The facility never reached its potential. Thanks to a strike in 1981 and big-picture conditions, the recession of 1981-82, the apparent end of steady 6% annual growth in global demand for steel, the plant's finishing lines were never built, so steel had to be sent up to Hamilton to be processed. At 2.5 million tons a year, the plant produces a fraction of what it was supposed to. That was the peak. 26,000 workers, $3 billion in sales, the most modern integrated mill in North America. And inside the numbers, already, the architecture of decline, a plant that would never be completed, a union that had won the battle and accelerated the losing of the war, a tariff wall that was about to come down, and a pension system that was quietly, invisibly, catastrophically underfunded. Somewhere south of the border, in the boardrooms that Stelco's workers would never see the inside of, someone was already running the numbers. Chapter 9. The wall comes down. The layoffs started after the 1981 strike, and they didn't stop for 20 years. Manufacturing meltdown, the academic study reviewed in the Hamilton Spectator, documented it with the precision of a coroner's report. Serious layoffs at Stelco started after the 1981 strike. At Stelco, that translated into almost 16,000 lost jobs between 1981 and 2003, cutting the labor force to about 9,000 from 26,000. 16,000 jobs. Not over a decade of sudden plant closures, over 2 decades of steady, grinding attrition. A few hundred here, a shift eliminated there, a department consolidated, a process automated, a contract not renewed. The parking lot that once held 3,000 cars began to thin. Then the far section stayed empty. Then weeds cracked through the asphalt where the overflow used to park. 3 forces were tearing the wall down simultaneously, and each one alone would have been manageable. Together, they were fatal. The first was competition. Nucor and the American mini-mill operators had figured out that you didn't need a blast furnace to make commodity steel. An electric arc furnace, fed with scrap metal, could produce structural shapes and rebar and wire rod at a fraction of the capital cost of an integrated mill. The mini-mills didn't have 100-year-old coke ovens to maintain. They didn't have 1,100-acre sites to heat and patrol and insure. They didn't have pension obligations stretching back to the 1940s. They ran lean, hired non-union, and undercut the integrated producers on price with a ruthlessness that Hamilton's cost structure simply couldn't match. The second was trade policy, and it arrived with a specific date and a specific signature. On January 1, 1989, the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement came into effect. Brian Mulroney had signed it the previous year, winning the 1988 federal election on the issue against John Turner's Liberals, who had campaigned against it with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The agreement didn't close any factories that day. What it did was remove the wall, the tariff wall that John A. Macdonald had erected in 1879, the same wall that had made Stelco's founding possible, the same wall that had sheltered Canadian steelmakers from American competition for over a century. The wall came down gradually, and gradually the factories followed. NAFTA, signed in 1994, widened the opening further. By the mid-1990s, American steel could enter Canada at prices that Hamilton's integrated mills, with their older equipment and higher labor costs, could not profitably match on commodity grades. The third force was internal, and it was the quietest and the deadliest. Ontario Regulation 5.1, a pre-1990s amendment to the Ontario Pension Benefits Act, allowed large corporations to skip solvency funding obligations during periods when their pension plans appeared adequately funded on a going concern basis. The regulation was designed to give companies breathing room during good years, a pension contribution holiday that let them redirect cash toward capital investment or debt repayment, instead of topping up plans that were, on paper, in surplus. Stelco took full advantage. Through the 1990s, as the workforce shrank and the ratio of active workers to pensioners inverted, Stelco's management deferred billions in solvency funding. The logic seemed sound at the time. The plans were funded above the regulatory threshold. The stock market was booming, and investment returns would cover the gap. By 2004, when the stock market had crashed, interest rates had fallen, and the number of pensioners had swollen far beyond the number of active workers contributing, the gap had become a chasm. The pension deficit stood at exactly $1,250 million, more than 5 times the company's estimated annual losses. The 1990 strike, 97 days at Hamilton, possibly 106 at Lake Erie, bled the company of whatever margin remained. By the mid-1990s, technology and competition had shrunk the workforce so dramatically that, as the Globe and Mail would later put it, Stelco turned into a company with more pensioners than employees, an imbalance that grew steadily worse. A company of survivors, 9,000 active workers supporting the pension obligations of more than 10,000 retirees and their dependents, trying to compete against mini-mills with no pension legacy and American integrated producers with deeper capital markets and a weaker dollar. Management churned through the decade. John D. Allen, Frederick Telmer, Robert Heno, Robert Milbourne, James Alfano. Each one tried to find a way through, and each one discovered that the structural problems were beyond any single executive's capacity to solve. As of 1995, per the Globe and Mail, the company could boast it was in good health. It had 11 subsidiaries, a high return on equity, a low debt-to-equity ratio, and almost $200 million in cash reserves. The numbers looked fine. The pension time bomb ticked beneath them, and the environment was tightening from another direction. In 1989, the Toronto Star had listed Stelco and Dofasco among Ontario's dirty dozen polluters. For many years, Steeltown's 2 giants pumped liquid discharges that contained cyanide, phosphorus, ammonia, solvents, and phenols straight into Hamilton Harbor. Stelco, in particular, was still pumping more phenols and cyanide into the harbor than it was supposed to in early 1987. Pollution control orders from Queen's Park forced expensive retrofits through the 1990s. By 1985, Hilton Works alone had 49 wastewater cleaning facilities and 54 air cleaning facilities, an environmental infrastructure layered on top of an aging industrial one, each retrofit adding cost without adding a single ton of steel to the output. By 2003, Stelco had lost more than $500 million in a single year. The company was projected to run out of cash by November 2004. The wall was down. The competitors were inside. The pension deficit was $1.25 billion, and a man who had never made a ton of steel in his life was about to walk through the gates of Hilton Works and take the company into bankruptcy. Chapter 10. Into the Blast Furnace. Courtney Pratt was a Bay Street executive, Noranda, then Toronto Hydro, who joined Stelco's board in 2002 and became CEO in January 2004, after James Alfano's resignation the previous summer. He was not a steelman. He had never stood beside a blast furnace. He had never smelled coke oven gas at 4 in the morning or felt the floor shake under a rolling mill. But he understood a balance sheet, and the balance sheet told him that Stelco was dying. With insolvency advisor Hap Stephen, Pratt took the company into Companies Creditors Arrangement Act protection in January 2004. CCAA, the Canadian equivalent of Chapter 11, was supposed to give the company breathing room to restructure while continuing to operate. Pratt's public statements were measured and urgent. At the Empire Club on April 22, 2004, he laid it out. Failure would mean liquidation. Failure would mean the end of Stelco as we know it today. We have a one-time chance to succeed. The numbers were staggering. 6,000 active employees, 10,000 pensioners, a pension deficit of $1.25 billion, more than $500 million lost in 2003, $36 million lost in the first quarter of 2004 alone. The pension deficit was more than 5 times the company's annual losses, a hole so deep that normal operations could never fill it, no matter how many tons of steel Stelco shipped. Justice James Farley's ruling on the CCAA application was controversial then and remains contentious now. Even though Stelco had $163 million in cash and credit, and steel prices were rising sharply in fact, as Chinese demand was pulling global steel markets upward, Farley broadly interpreted the test for insolvency, including Stelco's pension liabilities in the equation, even though they would not have been payable for several years following any liquidation. The legal community debated the ruling intensely. USW Local 1005 President Rolf Gerstenberger was less diplomatic. He called it CCAA fraud and legalized theft. Gerstenberger, who had succeeded earlier leaders and would become one of the most quoted voices in Stelco's decline, offered a detail in a 2016 interview that cut through the legal abstractions to the absurdity underneath. Then Courtney Pratt comes to us and says the contract says we're supposed to give you a bonus. Would it be all right if we give you all a bonus? The first time in 10 years. And we're in bankruptcy. Okay, come on now. The laughter in his voice carried something heavier than amusement. Bids arrived. Russia's Severstal offered a takeover with a pension solution. Deutsche Bank proposed refinancing. TD Securities, Sherritt International, and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan Consortium all made approaches. Stelco rejected everyone, controversially because steel prices were suddenly spiking and the company was making money again. The McGuinty government in Ontario provided a $150 million loan at 1% interest for 10 years, 75% forgivable if the pension deficit was eliminated, in exchange for Stelco paying $400 million into its pension plans. Queen's Park then stripped Stelco of its legislated pension funding holidays. The federal government contributed $30 million for energy conversion. Stelco emerged from CCAA on March 31, 2006, 26 months after filing, one of the longest corporate restructurings in Canadian history. The pensions were preserved with a 10-year fixed payment plan to return the funds to full solvency by 2015. The post-CCAA company was effectively controlled by TriCap Management, Brookfield's distressed debt arm, alongside Sunrise Partners and David Tepper's Appaloosa Management. Rodney B. Mott took over as CEO. The company was alive. The pension plans had a path to solvency. The steel market was strong, and within 18 months, every bit of it would be sold to a buyer whose promises would prove worth less than the paper they were printed on. Chapter 11. 31. Promises. The deal was announced on August 26, 2007. United States Steel Corporation, the company founded by J.P. Morgan and Elbert Gary in 1901, the company that had once produced 2/3 of all American steel, the company whose name was synonymous with American industrial power, agreed to acquire Stelco for $38.50 Canadian per share in cash, totaling approximately $1.1 billion for equity, plus the assumption of roughly $750 million in existing Stelco debt. The total enterprise value was approximately $1.9 billion Canadian dollars. Shareholders owning more than 76% of the company, including TriCap, Sunrise, Appaloosa, and Stelco CEO Rodney Mott himself, had pre-committed to support the deal before it was announced. The distressed debt funds that had bought into Stelco during the CCAA process at pennies on the dollar were about to cash out at a premium that would have seemed hallucinatory 3 years earlier. Chairman and CEO John P. Surma drove the acquisition from U.S. Steel's headquarters in Pittsburgh. His stated rationale was operational synergy, processing Canadian slabs at American finishing facilities, increasing utilization of U.S. Steel's Minnesota ore operations, expanding the company's Great Lakes footprint. In the Globe and Mail's account, Surma took one last shot, a $1.1 billion offer that would vault U.S. Steel up a notch to become the world's 5th largest steelmaker. On October 29, 2007, Industry Minister Maxime Bernier, a conservative MP from Beauce, Quebec, in Stephen Harper's government, approved the transaction under the Investment Canada Act, subject to 31 binding undertakings. The key terms, surfaced through subsequent litigation and union sources, were specific. Maintain 3,105 workers in Canada. produce more than 13 million tons of steel over 3 years, an average of 4.3 million tons annually. Invest $200 million Canadian dollars in Canadian facilities by October 31, 2012. Guarantee Stelco's pension funding under the 2006 agreement, plus a voluntary $31 million U.S. contribution to the main pension plans at closing. Endow a priority chair in Materials Science and Engineering at McMaster University. The full text of the undertakings was never publicly released. As of May 2026, it remains sealed. Stelco employees were, by most accounts, relieved. Gary Howe, who would become Local 1005 president, looked back in 2016 with the clarity of hindsight. When Stelco was sold and U.S. Steel came in, there were a lot of people who were excited about U.S. Steel buying us. It was going to be great for Hamilton, but it hasn't been. The deal closed October 31, 2007. Stelco was renamed U.S. Steel Canada Inc. and delisted from the Toronto Stock Exchange. The 31 promises were now binding law. 18 months later, nearly all of them would be broken. Chapter 12. The Lockout, the Lie, and the Last Heat. It began with 700 layoffs in late November 2008. The global financial crisis had cratered steel demand. Auto sector sales at Lake Erie had fallen 28% in a single month. U.S. Steel shut down the Hamilton blast furnace and sent 700 workers home. The union, watching from the picket line of experience, knew what was coming before the company said it. On March 3, 2009, U.S. Steel announced it was temporarily idling Hamilton and most of Lake Erie works. More than 2,000 workers were displaced. Temporarily, the company said. But Rolf Gerstenberger understood the mechanics of what temporarily meant when the parent company sat in Pittsburgh and had its own American furnaces to restart first. The problem, he said, is that U.S. Steel doesn't need our production. They shut down our blast furnaces and started up 2 in the States and are shipping steel up from the States now. On May 5, 2009, Industry Minister Tony Clement, Harper's third industry minister, after Bernier's approval and Jim Prentice's interim tenure, notified U.S. Steel under Section 39 of the Investment Canada Act that it was not in compliance with 2 undertakings: steady employment and continued production. In the summer of 2009, Ottawa filed Canada's first-ever ICA enforcement action under Section 40, seeking compliance plus a penalty of $10,000 for each day of breach. It was the first time in the history of the Investment Canada Act that the federal government had ever tried to enforce the promises a foreign buyer had made. The first time. In 24 years of the Act's existence, through hundreds of foreign acquisitions of Canadian companies, no government had ever used the enforcement mechanism. The promises, it turned out, had always been voluntary in practice, written in binding language, filed with the minister, and then quietly forgotten. U.S. Steel's defense was the Act of God clause, Section 38 of the ICA's Administrative Guidelines, which excuses non-performance where inability to fulfill a commitment is clearly the result of factors beyond the control of the investor. The 2008 financial crisis, U.S. Steel argued, was such a factor. The courts disagreed. Federal Court, 2010, rejected U.S. Steel's constitutional challenge. Federal Court of Appeal, 2011, affirmed. Supreme Court of Canada, November 24, 2011, denied leave to appeal. U.S. Steel lost at every level of the Canadian judiciary. But winning in court and winning in practice are different things in Canadian federal politics. While the litigation ground forward, U.S. Steel locked out its Canadian workers. Bill Ferguson's USW Local 8782 at Lake Erie was locked out in the summer of 2009 after U.S. Steel engaged in what Ferguson called surface bargaining, going through the motions of negotiation while proposing concessions so deep that rejection was inevitable. The Lake Erie lockout lasted 8 months. Approximately 400 workers never got their jobs back, too old, gone elsewhere, on welfare, or returned to school. Their careers at Stelco ended not with a retirement dinner, but with a padlocked gate and a legal notice. On November 7, 2010, U.S. Steel locked out approximately 900 unionized workers at Hamilton Works. The issues were cost of living indexing for 9,000 retirees and a base year change from 1971 to 2002 that would have slashed the value of the pension formula. The Hamilton lockout lasted 49 weeks, nearly 11 months. Through a Hamilton winter and into the following autumn, 900 workers and their families lived on strike pay and whatever savings they had, watching from the other side of the fence as U.S. Steel shipped American steel north to serve the Canadian customers that Stelco had supplied for a century. The two union locals believed something darker was at work. The Buy American stipulation in the U.S. government's stimulus program, they argued, made it politically impossible for U.S. Steel to lay off American workers while keeping Canadians employed. The Canadian operations weren't just expendable, they were required to be sacrificed so that the American ones could be preserved. Gary Howe identified 2008 as the inflection point, the moment when U.S. Steel's Canadian workforce became a liability on the wrong side of the border. The Hamilton lockout ended on October 15, 2011, with a 61% ratification of a 3-year contract that created a 2-tier pension, new hires on an inferior plan, ended cost of living indexing for 9,000 retirees in exchange for a one-time $1,000 lump sum for those receiving less than $1,500 a month, and introduced profit sharing tied to Hamilton Works earnings above $25 million. The workers returned for safety training on October 18th. Many of them would not work long. On December 12, 2011, 3 weeks after the Supreme Court denied U.S. Steel's final appeal, Industry Minister Christian Paradis announced an out-of-court settlement. The terms, U.S. Steel would continue producing steel in Canada until 2015, make at least $50 million in additional capital investments, and contribute exactly $3 million toward community and educational programs. $50 million and $3 million in community money for a company that had promised $200 million in capital investment, 3,105 permanent jobs, and 13 million tons of steel. The full settlement text was sealed by court order. No Canadian citizen has ever been allowed to read it. The NDP, the USW, the City of Hamilton, the retirees, and the salaried pensioners all demanded the settlement's release. Ontario Superior Court Justice Herman Wilton Siegel ruled in 2015 that the ICA's non-disclosure regime, a very tight non-disclosure regime, prevented it. The settlement stayed sealed. The promises stayed broken. On December 31, 2013, U.S. Steel CEO Mario Longhi confirmed what everyone in Hamilton already knew. Iron and steelmaking at Hamilton Works were permanently closed. The blast furnaces that had run since Hugh Hilton's day, that had thrown their orange glow across Burlington Bay for half a century, would never be tapped again. 47 non-union employees were affected by the final announcement. The heyday workforce of 14,000 at Hilton Works was now 600 unionized active workers, with 8,000 pensioners, depending on a company that had just been gutted by its American parent. J.P. Marin, a retired steelworker and union executive, said what the city was thinking. It's a black day for Canada. It's another example of a foreign takeover of a Canadian company. They promise everything, and they just shut her down. Then came the worst part. On September 16, 2014, U.S. Steel Canada filed for CCAA protection, the second time Stelco's operations had been in court protection in a decade. On October 9, 2015, Justice Wilton Siegel approved a plan that severed U.S. Steel Canada from its American parent entirely. U.S. Steel walked away from $2.3 billion in claimed obligations. The court suspended health, dental, drug, and vision benefits for 20,600 retirees and their dependents. The drug and dental benefits alone had been costing the company approximately $3.5 million a month. Gone. Joe Bellone, 77 years old, a retired Stelco worker living on $700 a month in pension, had told CBC years earlier what the prospect meant to him. Of course I do worry, because I won't be able to have enough money to live on. If I lose half of it, what am I going to do? How am I going to live? Chris Young, a Nanticoke steelworker with 30 years of service and drug benefits up to $3,000 a year, stood outside the court hearing and said, "They should not be allowed to get away with this. D'Amato Corr, a retiree, tacked a message about his plight to his walker and marched to the Hamilton Convention Center in January 2016. Bill Misson, a former senior vice president, filed an affidavit stating, "While the transition fund is greatly appreciated, it is not close to being a replacement of the post-retirement benefits." U.S. steel flags were removed from the Hamilton plants within minutes of the court decision. Marty Warren, USW Ontario Director, spoke for 20,000 families. "There will be 20,000 pensioners waking up tomorrow without health benefits and prescription drug coverage because of the Harper government's secret deals with U.S. Steel." Bill Ferguson, the Lake Erie local president who had lived through both lockouts, delivered the line that carries more weight than any statistic in this story. Speaking of the coke oven workers and the blast furnace men whose lungs and joints and skin bore the permanent marks of decades of heavy industrial labor, Ferguson said, "For the people who spent decades working in coke ovens and steel mills, health conditions abound and retirees depend on benefits. It's like working on the side of a volcano. Their lives are shortened substantially. That's the worst hit that we can possibly take. Working on the side of a volcano. And then being told, after 30 years, that the insurance against the eruption had been canceled." Chapter 13. What the contract bought. In November 2016, a deal was struck to sell the remains of U.S. Steel Canada to Bedrock Industries Group LLC, a Miami-based holding company founded by Alan Kestenbaum and private equity partner Lindsay Goldberg. On December 2, 2016, the Stelco name was restored. The deal closed in June 2017. Bedrock paid approximately 127 million Canadian dollars, roughly 1/10 of what U.S. Steel had paid a decade earlier. The CCAA process had wiped away $3 billion in debt and $1.4 billion in pension and other obligations. The new owners received a clean company, stripped of its liabilities, free of the promises U.S. Steel had made and broken. NDP MP Scott Duvall, a former steelworker representing Hamilton Mountain, stood at the name restoration ceremony and said what the pensioners were thinking. "I'm glad you're naming it Stelco, but by going back to the old name, how about you go back to the old way of paying pensioners their benefits?" Nobody went back. On November 3, 2017, Stelco listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange at $17 per share, raising $230 million in total gross proceeds. Kestenbaum and Lindsay Goldberg retained 85% of the shares. Over the following years, Lindsay Goldberg sold more than 31.5 million shares for proceeds of nearly $1 billion. The Bedrock Industries entity sold another 29 million shares for over $650 million. Kestenbaum personally retained 8.67 million shares. When Cleveland Cliffs acquired Stelco on November 1, 2024, for 70 Canadian dollars per share, a total enterprise value of 3.4 billion Canadian, Kestenbaum's remaining stake was worth approximately $607 million. The arithmetic is simple enough to state and difficult enough to absorb. U.S. Steel paid $1.9 billion for Stelco in 2007, broke its promises, gutted the company, stripped 20,600 pensioners of their health benefits, and walked away. Bedrock paid $127 million for the husk. The IPO raised $230 million. The secondary sales generated over $1.6 billion. Kestenbaum personally cleared more than $500 million. Cleveland Cliffs paid $3.4 billion, nearly double what U.S. Steel had paid, adjusted for inflation, for a company that no longer made steel in Hamilton. The pensioners received nothing, not a dollar of the IPO, not a share of the secondary proceeds, not a clause in the Cleveland Cliffs deal restoring what Justice Wilton Siegel's order had taken away. As of May 2026, 10 years after the benefits were suspended, 20,600 retirees and their dependents remain without the drug, dental, and vision coverage they earned through decades of work in the blast furnaces and coke ovens and rolling mills that made Stelco what it was. Marty Warren, in December 2016. As workers and pensioners suffer blow after blow, the deafening silence from the Liberals shows there is no real change. The Liberals continue where the Conservatives left off, leaving pensioners and workers on their own. The operational reality of Stelco in 2026 is this. Approximately 750 workers at the Hamilton site, running coke ovens and cold rolling and finishing lines. No steelmaking, no blast furnaces, no iron. Approximately 1,400 at Lake Erie Works, which added pig iron production in January 2021. Total workforce, roughly 2,200. The company that employed 26,000 in 1981 now employs fewer people than a mid-sized hospital. Across the harbor, Arcelor Middle Dofasco employs approximately 5,000 people. It maintains its profit-sharing pool, 14% of pre-tax profit distributed equally to all eligible workers. It is pursuing a $1.8 billion green steel conversion to electric arc furnace production. It is Hamilton's largest private sector employer. Its smokestacks belch steam day and night, visible from the same escarpment that once looked down on the orange glow of Stelco's blast furnaces. Two companies, same city, same harbor, same labor pool. Opposite outcomes. The site itself tells the rest of the story. Blast Furnace D was demolished in 2004. Blast Furnace E, the last one, the tall one, the one that defined the Hamilton skyline, was demolished by controlled explosion in 2022. The blast audible from Waterdown to the Upper Mountain, across Burlington, and into the suburbs where the grandchildren of steelworkers looked up from their phones at a sound they couldn't place. Priestley Demolition explained that the explosive cut was necessary because the structure was too tall and too heavy for any other method to be used, without putting lives of the workers at risk. 800 acres of the former Hilton Works were sold to Slate Asset Management in 2022 for redevelopment as a world-class industrial park. Stelco leased back 75 acres and 2 million square feet of buildings for 35 years. And offshore, in Hamilton Harbor, sits the physical legacy of a century of steelmaking. Randall Reef, named after Captain Harvey T. Randall, a Marine pilot stranded on the reef in 1964, is the largest contaminated sediment site on the Canadian Great Lakes. Approximately 60 hectares of harbor bottom contaminated with roughly 615,000 to 695,000 cubic meters of coal tar sediment, heavy and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the chemical residue of more than 100 years of coal gasification, petroleum refining, and steel production. The remediation cost $138.9 million, funded equally by federal, provincial, and municipal governments, plus industry contributions. 3,400 steel beams, each between 23 and 33 meters long, were drilled into the harbor floor to form a 6.2-hectare engineered containment facility, a steel box on the bottom of the harbor to entomb the poison that a century of steelmaking left behind, the toxic legacy buried in a cage made of steel. The metaphor writes itself. Chapter 14. The Orange Glow. Michael Lechniak joined Stelco in 2007, just before the U.S. Steel takeover. His father Steve had worked there for 36 years. Michael works in the coke ovens, the same ovens that the NFB filmed, the same ovens where the lung cancer rates were the highest in the country, the same ovens that still operate under repeated emissions exceedances cited by the Ontario Ministry of the Environment. He once rescued a cat named Oreo from the coke oven structures, where feral colonies lived among the furnace infrastructure, eating the mice that bred in the coal stockpiles. The father retired before the worst of it. The son walked into the worst of it with his eyes open. That is the story, compressed to its smallest human unit. One family, 2 generations. The father who knew Stelco when it was the beating heart of a city. The son who works in what's left. There is no dedicated Stelco museum. The industrial memory of Hamilton is scattered. The Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre at 51 Stewart Street, Canada's only museum dedicated to working-class history. The McMaster University Library Archives, holding the USW Local 1005 fonds, one of the richest labor history collections in the country. The Stelco Tower at 100 King Street West, the most visible monument, even though Stelco vacated it long ago, and the company now operates from a building on Wilcox Street, named for the man who rode into Hamilton on horseback in 1880, The tower still stands. The furnaces don't. What Stelco built is still here, embedded in the country the way rebar is embedded in concrete. Invisible, structural, bearing weight that nobody thinks about. The car doors and highway overpasses and apartment foundations and tin cans and appliance panels. All of it made from steel poured in Hamilton, rolled in Hamilton, shipped from Hamilton to every corner of a country that consumed it without knowing its name. The product was invisible. The factory was iconic. And the pensioners, the men and women who breathed the coke oven gas and stood in the heat of the blast furnace and built the working-class middle class of a city, they're still here too, still waiting, still without the benefits that were promised to them when the work was dangerous and their bodies were young enough to take it. Stelco was not killed by a market. Markets shift and companies adapt or they don't, and the ones that don't are mourned briefly and forgotten. Stelco was killed by a contract. 31 binding undertakings signed under the Investment Canada Act in October 2007, broken before the ink had set, litigated through every level of the Canadian judiciary, and settled in a sealed document that no citizen of the country has ever been permitted to read. The contract was the weapon, the settlement was the burial, and the pensioners were left standing at the graveside, wondering what exactly had been agreed to, in their name and on their behalf, by a government that had approved the sale and then refused to enforce its own conditions. The orange glow is gone from Hamilton's skyline. The blast furnaces are rubble. The harbor is being cleaned, one steel-caged hectare of contaminated sediment at a time. The coke ovens still run, and Michael Lechniak still walks through the gates his father walked through. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Ottawa, there is a document that explains exactly how much a century of Canadian steelmaking was worth to the people who decided its fate. The document is sealed. The silence is not.